I'm delighted to be able to welcome Professor Patman and introduce him to you. He's been a good friend of mine now for many years. He was raised in England. He was educated his undergraduate degree at the University of Lancaster. He did a master's degree at University of Warwick and a PhD at University of Southampton, one of the very nice universities in England. His PhD was in Soviet foreign policy and in the Russian language. And in fact, his first book was on the role of the Soviet Union in the Horn of Africa. And that's how I first became acquainted with him, was through that book, before I ever had met him personally. And since that time, we've become close friends. I've been a Fulbright professor and a visiting professor at the University of Otago, and this is his second visit here now, so we're delighted to have him here. He is the author of many, many books. I won't bother to read them all. I will tell you that he is the Prager series editor for a series of books on the ethics of foreign policy. He's hoping to turn that into something other than an oxymoron. Now, if any of you ever travel, I also want to tell you that he has established a wonderful Master's in International Studies program at the University of Otago. There are many people involved in it, but I would be less than honest if I didn't tell you it's his program, and he did all the work and put that together, and he's an outstanding teacher. I think he's personally responsible for much of the growth of the politics program at the University of Otago in New Zealand. And if any of you students are interested in pursuing a Master's of International Studies please talk to him after the lecture. He'd be glad to give you some information. We're happy to have Gordon Lindsay with us, whose son is down there right now, son and daughter-in-law, pursuing a master's in that program. You also might be interested to know that Professor Patman, if you ever travel to New Zealand, you'll want to write his name down, because wherever you go throughout all of New Zealand, it's a small country, 4 million people, all you have to do is say, "I'm a friend of Robert Patman," and you have entree, because he is the leading commentator on New Zealand television and radio series about not only U.S. foreign policy, but also just about international politics. And after 9/11, his face was on every channel, in New Zealand many, many times. So be sure and write his name down if you ever plan to travel to New Zealand. You will have entree wherever you go if you just mention that you know Robert Patman. So, Professor Patman, it's a pleasure to have you here. We look forward to your presentation, and I think he plans to allow us to ask some questions near the end. Professor Patman.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Stan Taylor, for a very kind introduction, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Corey Leonard and Jeff Ringer and Stan, of course, and the rest of the Kennedy Center team for facilitating my visit. It's a great personal pleasure to be back at BYU. I haven't been here since 1993, and Stan was showing me around the campus yesterday, and I've seen some enormous changes. I hope to see the new underground part of the library this afternoon. Thanks to Stan's work in forging links between Otago and BYU, there have been quite a few developments, and I hope this talk can, in a modest fashion, cement the process of deepening the links between BYU and the University of Otago. Otago, which caused me a few pronunciation problems when I first got to New Zealand, because I naturally said Otago, and a Kiwi immediately said to me, "Well, just think of Wells Fargo, it's Otago." So it may be a useful reminder. Stan was also kind enough to say that I do a little bit of commentary and media work in New Zealand. What he didn't say is that it's not necessarily, how should I put it, an entree to good relations, because if you're mad enough as an academic to voice your views on international affairs, you don't always get, how should I put it, spontaneous applause. Sometimes you say things the audience does not want to hear, but so be careful about taking his advice. Now, let me just say, if I may, a few words about my presentation today. This research that I'm engaged in draws on work that has been prepared for a chapter in a book by two fine scholars, Michael Cox and Douglas Stokes. They produced a book for Oxford University Press on American foreign policy. They just simply asked me to prepare the chapter on America, the United States policy towards Africa, but they cover various dimensions of US foreign policy, and I believe the book is due to be out in April 2008. Now, one of the hallmarks of President George W. Bush's foreign policy has been the steady re-emergence of Africa as an area of strategic importance for the United States. An indication of this new thinking appeared in 2005 when the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO Commander Marine General James Jones, said to a surprised audience that NATO should be called the US, European and African Command. Now, while Africans may take exception to being cast as part of Washington's global strategic network and the global strategic network of its allies, it seems to me that it's important to notice this new emphasis that has occurred since 9/11. All this seems a far cry from President Bush's, and I think I've used Joe Nye's nice distinction between Bush the 43rd and Bush the 41st. So I'm referring here to Bush the 43rd. All this seems a far cry from President Bush, 43rd, his approach to Africa when he first was running for office. In 2000, as a presidential candidate, Bush indicated a lack of strategic interest in Africa and expressed his strong opposition to what he called nation building, a reference to the use of US forces for the purpose of re-establishing a viable state in countries where such structures are weak or failing states. This presentation proceeds in 4 stages. The first part, or it'd be the second part now because I've done the introduction already. The second part, we look at US-Africa relations during the Cold War period. Just a very brief context setting section. The next section examines the immediate post-Cold War period in which Bush the 41st coined the term the New World Order, which essentially envisaged a strategic partnership between the United States and the UN for managing the post-Cold War world. Now, we know, of course, with benefit of hindsight, that partnership did not come to fruition. But we need to look at that period. It was a period which opened up the possibilities of positive US engagement in Africa. We will then begin to look at how policy developed, US policy developed towards Africa in the 1990s. We will see a period of retreat after the Somali debacle of 1993, followed by the first year of the second Clinton administration by a policy of partial re-engagement in Africa. That sets the scene, of course, for 9/11 and US policy thereafter. So that's the sequence which I hope to work through, and I also hope to leave 15 minutes for questions, but always a word of health warning on that one, because when academics say that they're going to stick to the time limit, you need to know that is very rarely the case, but I will try and be an exception to the rule. Africa in the Cold War. US engagement, I'm jumping ahead of myself. America, of course, because of its composition, 25% of America's composition being African Americans, does, in a sense, have a historic connection with Sub-Saharan Africa. However, there seems to be general agreement that US African policies from the founding of the Republic in 1789 to the present have been marked by indifference at worst and at best by semi-detachment. In short, there's been little consistent engagement in Africa. Africa has sometimes been treated as a bit of a foreign policy backwater in official policy-making circles. However, the Cold War and the fact that it coincided with a period of consistent US engagement after 1945 began to change that. US engagement with Africa certainly increased during the Cold War. Indeed, the Cold War brought about a fundamental change in US foreign policy. From 1947, the United States had to become organized for a long-term struggle with the Soviet Union and the real prospect of war in order to protect its national interests. Now, these ideas clearly framed US foreign policy towards Africa. It was essentially a policy of selective engagement. Washington essentially treated African countries as agents or pawns in a global strategic contest with the Soviet Union. I won't run through all the crises that occurred in Africa during this period, but there are a number, particularly in the early 60s in the Congo. Then there was a critical confrontation in the Horn of Africa in 77, 78. And there was also rivalry over the civil war in Angola. A number of flashpoints. But if US engagement in Africa was defined by Cold War competition, that is a desire to minimize Soviet influence in the continent, it's also true that sometimes developments in Africa did actually play a part in shaping Washington's containment policy. It wasn't just a one-way street. I think nowhere was this truer than in the Horn of Africa, which was probably, in terms of superpower competition, was the second most strategically contested area after the Middle East during the Cold War. The United States found itself displaced by the Soviet Union in Ethiopia. It found itself displaced in Ethiopia by the Soviet Union and was left something as a bystander as the Soviet Union intervened to determine the outcome of a war between two neighbouring countries, Ethiopia and Somalia. That experience helped to end America's, I wouldn't say flirtation, but experience of détente. It was Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, I think put it very well. He said SALT, the strategic arms limitation talks, lies buried in the sands of the Ogaden, unquote. In other words, for the United States, the Soviet victory, and I put that in inverted commas because it was a short-term victory rather than a long-term one, in the Horn of Africa in 77, 78, led to a determination in the United States to move away from détente and, particularly after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, to pursue a policy of more, if you like, re-intensified containment of the Soviet Union. It propelled the United States, in other words, towards a second Cold War through a re-emergence of intense rivalry. The end of the Cold War in the late 1980s seemed to offer an extraordinary opportunity for a policy of US engagement with Africa. At the beginning of this new era, George H.W. Bush, or George Bush the 41st, I'll get there in a minute, so I'm having trouble. I think I'll stick to my original formulation. George Bush's father, when he was president, and Bill Clinton, their administrations appeared confident about constructing what President Bush Sr. called a new world order. What did he mean by this phrase? He never really specified it in precise terms, but I think there's three elements that we as students of the subject might want to note. First, there was the political conviction that the new post-Cold War order should guarantee security, defend freedom, promote democracy, and enforce the rule of law where possible. A second key belief in the new world order concept was the key diplomatic and political institution for operating and managing the new order was the UN. It should be recalled that the UN, in partnership with the United States, played a pivotal role in helping to facilitate the ejection of Saddam Hussein's forces from Kuwait after the invasion of August 1990. A third element is that the Bush administration anticipated an active leadership role for the United States in partnership with the UN in creating and maintaining this new world order. Once again, the model of the Persian Gulf crisis of 1990-91, I think, came to the fore. It was one of strong US leadership underpinned by UN-authorized coalition diplomacy. Now, certainly during the period 1989 to 1992, Africa featured in Washington's vision of a new world order. The United States was active in the area of conflict resolution in a number of areas in Africa. For example, the United States and Russia worked closely through the UN to bring an end to the civil war in Mozambique in the late 80s. It also worked closely to facilitate the independence of Namibia. Political reform was emphasized in Washington's policy, post-Cold War policy towards Africa. After the Ethiopian dictator Mengistu Haile Mariam fled from his country in May 1991, it was Washington which had a distant relationship with the country during the intervening period between 1977 and 1991, which became involved in playing, I would say, a crucial role in establishing transitional political arrangements in that country. So there was evidence that the United States was becoming very much involved in quite a constructive form of engagement, particularly in conflict resolution, but in also, to some extent, nation building during this period. However, the most visible expression of a new American approach to Africa was the 1992-93 humanitarian intervention in Somalia. In 1992, constant civil war and drought had combined to produce a catastrophic famine, killing an estimated 300,000 Somalis. On the 3rd of December 1992, the UN Security Council, in its capacity to decide of matters of international peace and security, had become convinced that the situation in Somalia had become intolerable, and it authorised a US-led unified task force known as UNITAF to use all necessary means to ensure a secure environment for the distribution of humanitarian aid in that country. Now, this intervention, I think, is worth dwelling on for a moment because it still has reverberations for this period since then, and indeed in the 21st century. The intervention was a landmark decision for both the UN and the United States. It was the first time the Security Council had sanctioned a major enforcement action under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter in a theoretically sovereign state. In other words, it was authorising armed humanitarian intervention without the consent of any of the warring parties in that country. The second landmark feature, and this applied to the United States, it was in many ways an abrupt departure from previous American policy towards Somalia. Somalia, of course, in the late 80s had lost in many ways its strategic value as a partner of the United States, and the Siad Barre dictatorship found itself increasingly without US support from 1989 onwards. The brutal policies of the dictatorship in Somalia meant that Congress prevented President Bush, or certainly put pressure on the Bush administration to withhold economic and military assistance to that country. So without that support, the days of the Barre regime were numbered, and it duly collapsed in January 1991. The point to note is that the decision to intervene was something of a departure because up until July 1992, the Bush administration had taken the view that essentially it was a problem that should be handled through the UN and by, if you like, the former European colonial powers in the continent. However, there was a change of mind in Washington, not least because of the graphic images that began to come into the United States as the horrific crisis unfolded in Somalia. The point to note, it was the first time in recent memory that the United States decided to explicitly justify sending its troops to a foreign country, not to safeguard US strategic interests, but to perform a humanitarian mission. So this was a landmark for the US, for the Pentagon and the US military forces. Now, the Somali crisis, I think, identified a number of key features of the post-Cold War security environment. In my paper, I've identified 7, but let me just mention 2 in passing here, and I can certainly be happy to elaborate if anybody wants some more information about this. I think, first of all, the Somali crisis highlighted that weak or failed states, that is, states with little or no legitimate or functioning government, with little or no control over its territory, were now the main source of threat in stability in the post-Cold War era. Secondly, these new civil conflicts were typically characterised by the absence or the inadequacy of a legitimate government. Third, many of these new wars were driven by issues of identity and often involved the mobilisation of movements along ethnic, tribal, racial or religious lines. There were many other Somalias to follow in the post-Cold War era, and I think there was a number of common threads running through the Somali crisis which would reproduce themselves subsequently in the unfolding period. So in that sense, Somalia's importance, if you want, transcended the specific context of the crisis itself, and I think had reverberations. Now, if Somalia was, as I have argued, a paradigm for the post-Cold War security environment, the Bush and the Clinton administrations did struggle to come to terms with it. The US-led UN operation ran into problems almost immediately and ultimately proved to be a profound disappointment. Nation building was not written into the United Task Force mandate, and instead of striving to stabilise Somalia through political reform, UNITAF concentrated largely on short-term humanitarian needs. This led to a situation that by October 1993, the US and the UN found itself in confrontation with the most formidable armed faction in Somalia, led by General Ardid. President Clinton warned it would be open season on Americans all over the world if the United States pulled out of Somalia in the wake of the bloody confrontation which occurred in against General Ardid's forces on the 3rd of October 1993. Some of you may have seen the movie Black Hawk Down, which I think was an excellent account of what happened. It certainly captured the drama of the event. President Clinton, as I said, he was very conscious on the one hand of what might happen if the United States pulled out prematurely, as he saw it after this confrontation with Ardid's forces. On the other hand, he was also very responsive, as any president is, to mounting domestic concern, particularly the images of dead Americans being dragged through the streets of Somalia by followers of Ardid. And what he did, he tried to square the circle. He said that we're staying for the moment and we're going to increase our commitment, and then he added in the next breath, but that commitment will end in 6 months. So in a sense, it was quite clever. He tried to reconcile conflicting pressures. There was tremendous pressure, particularly from the Republicans in Congress, but not just in the Republicans, but also in the Democrats. Robert Byrd, for example, on the Democrat side, exerted a lot of pressure to pull American troops back as soon as possible. At the same time, Clinton was intellectually aware that this could embolden forces which were taking on the United States and US interests, not only in Africa but elsewhere. We now know, of course, that Al-Qaeda had a low-level involvement in training General Ardid's forces, but more about that during the question and answer period if you want to pursue it. The point to note is, in May '94, the Clinton administration passed Presidential Decision Directive, or PDD 25. Now, this directive said the United States would only participate in UN peacekeeping missions if they were in the national interest. This, of course, was a direct result of the Somali episode. In a sense, the President wanted to communicate to the American people that under his watch, he wanted to diffuse or dispel the fear that America would get engaged in other nation-building exercises which could involve US casualties. He wanted to convey the idea that he would only be using US troops to defend specified and quite narrow, quite clearly evident US national interests. So in the wake of the unsuccessful US-UN operation in Somalia, there was a determination in Washington not to cross what might be called the Mogadishu line and engage in operations that had the potential to result in US casualties. Now, this had quite a profound impact on US policy in Africa. It began a period of retreat, essentially, in US foreign policy. This was evident, firstly, in the case of Rwanda, which began to develop almost immediately after the Somali crisis. This was a major test for the new PDD 25 doctrine. The United States, under Clinton's leadership, was reluctant to do anything that would draw the United States in. As a result, the Clinton administration blocked the idea of an early deployment of UN troops to Rwanda in the Security Council. And reinforcements to forestall the prospect of genocide. Indeed, the term genocide was resisted by the administration for quite a long time. Now, of course, the administration didn't know that 800,000 people would be macheted to death in the interim, so I'm not suggesting there's anything sinister about this, but it did reflect the traumatic impact that Somalia had on US foreign policy. US concerns about conflicts in Africa and the perceived risk of becoming involved, I think, began to have other consequences. PD 25 called, amongst other things, for regional organisations on the continent to take more responsibility for the peacekeeping burden. The retreat from Africa also affected US support for democratisation on the continent. Remember, democratization was a key theme of the Clinton administration when it came to office. But there was a tacit recognition in Washington after Somalia that political liberalization could be associated with security problems in several countries, such as Central African Republic, Congo, Brazzaville, Lesotho, to mention a few. Furthermore, US assistance during this period began to decline. It already began to decline in the late 80s, but the process accelerated. In 1995, the US Congress sought to reorganize and substantially trim the existing US foreign assistance program. Now, what was interesting about this period, there was this period of retreat after Somalia, but by the first year of the second term of Clinton's administration, there was a period, I think, of renewed but limited US engagement in Africa. It reflected, I think, the gradual recognition, if you like, a process of learning was occurring, the growing recognition, the increasing recognition that in a globalizing world, a world that was ever more interconnected, the United States could not condition its involvement in Africa strictly according to national guidelines laid out in PDD 25. The lessons of Somalia, Rwanda and Liberia for the Clinton administration in the second term were that civil wars of the 1990s could be major international security problems which could not be ignored without the United States' international standing being affected. The United States was conscious that it took quite a lot of, when I say United States, I mean the Clinton administration was conscious that it took quite a lot of criticism, not only within the United States over its handling the Rwandan situation, but also internationally. So this prompted something of a period of re-engagement in African security. In a sense, the Clinton administration began to re-engage on a number of fronts. Let me mention some of them. For one thing, the Clinton administration became prominent in elevating the issue of HIV/AIDS pandemic. It also became active in trying to police trafficking in drugs, some of which were coming out of Africa, and also moving towards controlling illicit transfer of arms. It also was active in trying to prompt African regional organisations to take more responsibility for security. One concept that came up with was the African Crisis Response Force, which was subsequently superseded by something called the African Response Crisis Initiative. This was where the United States helped a number of African countries to take responsibility for training their own national forces, in fact, training the trainer to deal with conflicts in the region. Despite these measures, despite this partial re-engagement, it should be worth noting that the security threats in Africa increased during this period. In August 1998, US embassies in Tanzania and Kenya were bombed by al-Qaeda terrorists, killing 253 people. The al-Qaeda terrorists suspected of involvement in this, in fact, operated out of Nairobi, and they were linked to Somalia. There was close links between the al-Qaeda organisation in Nairobi and also remnants of the organisation in Somalia. But there was also, another setback in a sense was a bloody conflict between two US allies, Ethiopia and Eritrea. This erupted in 1998 and accounted for more than 70,000 lives during the next 2 years. So this period of partial re-engagement was not without its problems. But the Clinton administration certainly pressed on, and I think it should be noted the interesting role the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, its successor, George W. Bush administration, had played in elevating the active combating of HIV/AIDS, a disease which, of course, as many of you know, has decimated the African continent. The Clinton administration was certainly instrumental in moving the HIV/AIDS pandemic onto the international agenda. Indeed, I think it was Al Gore in 2002, in 1999, who defined AIDS as not just a health hazard, but also as a major security problem, and for Africa and the rest of the world. So there was progress there. There was also progress towards the end of the Clinton administration, the second half of the Clinton administration, in terms of official activities. There was a flurry of visits to Africa by high-level officials from Washington. President Clinton spent 2 weeks in Africa in August 1998. Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, she visited the continent 3 times, and Richard Holbrooke, I beg your pardon, visited the continent in December 2000 in his capacity as US ambassador to the UN. And Colin Powell, the Secretary of State for the first Bush administration, was quick off the mark in May 2001 by visiting the continent. However, it's fair to say that if there was increasing engagement by the Clinton administration, there was little indication that the new Bush administration was going to continue where the Clinton administration had left off. Bush said, when he was candidate, that he did not really see how involvement in Africa was actually in the strategic national interests of the United States. He also continued his vehement rejection of what he called nation building. He embraced the traditional view that security was fundamentally determined by the military means of sovereign states, and he advocated what he called a distinctly American internationalism. So that takes us to 9/11 and its aftermath. After the terrorist attacks of 11th of September, the Bush administration has certainly revised its approach towards Africa and acknowledged that the continent was a major strategic concern for the United States in the war on terror. Previous opposition to nation building was quietly de-emphasized as the Bush administration now recognized that weak or failing states could indeed be a security threat to the US. Africa was increasingly seen as a prime target for terrorist organization. In particular, Somalia, which had not had a government for more than 16 years, was seen as particularly vulnerable to penetrations by organizations like Al-Qaeda. There have been two major initiatives with respect to containing the threat of terrorism in Africa by the Bush administration. One was called the Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa. Sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful. That's the Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa initiative in December 2002. This essentially led to the deploying of 1,500 US troops in Djibouti, a neighbouring country of Ethiopia and Somalia in the Horn of Africa. There was also what was called the Pan-Sahel Initiative, which was a much more indirect effort to boost border defence capabilities of a number of countries to the west of the Horn, Chad, Niger, Mali, etc. But beyond these specific counter-terrorism strategies, and in concert with these formal initiatives, the US has also stepped up its assistance to non-state actors in Somalia, particularly those ones opposing what is seen as the prospect of terrorism coming from radical Islam. In Somalia, as I said, a country with no international recognised functioning government for now 17 years, the Bush administration became particularly alarmed by the rise of the Islamic Courts Union. This organisation developed in the mid-90s. It was sponsored by members of the Somali business community, desperate for more order. However, it did develop a radical wing, which had, I think, with some degree of, there's some degree of evidence to support this, quite clear links with Al-Qaeda. In early 2006, the Bush administration began to secretly fund and arm what was called the Alliance for the Restoration of Peace and Counter-Terrorism, which was a coalition established by secular warlords in Somalia to oppose the Islamic Courts Union in Mogadishu. On the 5th of June 2006, there was a battle for Mogadishu. Unfortunately for the alliance, it ended in the routing and dispersal of this alliance of warlords, which was supported by the United States. For the first time since the fall of Siad Barre dictatorship in 1991, Somalia's capital was firmly under the control of one group. So that was a bit of a defeat for the Bush administration with respect to Somalia, but it continued its efforts to contain the threat of Islamic radicalism in Somalia. And one of these efforts was the attempt to support, or at least not to oppose, an invasion by Ethiopia into Somalia to displace the now new Islamic government or regime that had established itself in Mogadishu. The current situation is that the Ethiopian revolution, the Ethiopian intervention was successful. It was coordinated by the United States and supported by it. It overthrew the Islamic regime. Unfortunately, the Islamic the Islamic Courts Union, as it's called, has dispersed and effectively has now begun an insurgency against the Ethiopian-supported government. So that's the present situation, really. We have a situation where the Bush administration has become increasingly concerned about the rise of terrorism in Africa. And let me sum up. While Africa has generally been on the periphery of America's foreign policy agenda, the events of the 11th of September significantly enhanced the strategic importance of Africa in President Bush's foreign policy. Amongst other things, Washington has established a new military base in Djibouti and bolstered the military capabilities of some state and non-state actors on the African continent. But to date, the Bush administration has shown very little inclination to come fully to terms with the globalization of the security environment that became evident in Africa in the early 1990s. What do I mean by that? Well, there is something of a tension between the current tendency in the Bush administration towards defining its interest in Africa in its own strategic national interest, the way it sees, and the way security is seen by people on the ground. For many people in Africa, they face multiple interlinked threats of hunger, disease, lawlessness, terrorism, and war. And in that sense, President Bush's recent counter-terrorist strategy has not won too much support. And I think what's happened in Somalia is a bit of a warning. Far from weakening the position of radical Islamicists in that country, the Bush administration may have actually boosted them by first backing a coalition of warlords who, according to most Somalis, are largely responsible for the mess the country's in. They're seen as criminals and war criminals at that. And secondly, to compound the problem, having seen that approach fail, the Bush administration endorsed the intervention of Ethiopia, a traditional adversary and enemy of Somalia, to prop up the weak but internationally recognised transitional federal government that unfortunately has very little support in the country. So we have a problem that a challenge remains of how to deal with the new threat of terrorism in Africa, and I think I better stop there. Thank you. Stan.
We'll get the mic to you, and if you just tell us your name and what you're studying as well.
Stan Taylor, I'm not certain what I'm studying, but Robert, I thank you for a wonderful presentation, the overview of the vacillation of U.S. foreign policy in that area of Africa and what has driven that vacillation, I think is very insightful. I guess I have two brief questions. One is, did President Clinton ever send Mrs. Clinton to Africa, and if so, did she come under sniper fire? No, I will skip that one. I am more interested in the role of Al-Qaeda, particularly in the Black Hawk Down situation.
Yeah.
I think for years most Americans have thought that the embassy bombings in Africa were the first manifestations of Al-Qaeda terrorism, but you've indicated, and my understanding is quite correctly, that there was an Al-Qaeda link in the Black Hawk Down situation. Is that?
Yes. We need to put this in perspective. Al-Qaeda got involved in Somalia a full year, I repeat that, a full year before the US-UN intervention in December 1992. They got involved in 1991. Al-Qaeda, which was a group formed in 1990 by Osama bin Laden after the conclusion of the Afghan war, a group of a fundamentalist, radical Islamic agenda, saw Somalia, in terms of its own political agenda, as being a country which might be ripe for influence in the future. Of course, Osama bin Laden had identified the United States as early as 1990 as being the number one enemy after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He bragged that having seen off one superpower, it wouldn't be too difficult to confront another. But as President Clinton made clear in I don't know if any of you saw this, a remarkable interview with Chris Wallace on Fox News in September 2006, and I think Bill Clinton was being absolutely fair and honest here. no one in the administration actually knew at that stage that Al-Qaeda had any involvement in Somalia in that period, which led to the Black Hawk Down episode. Had they known, I think Bill Clinton's reaction to the events on the 3rd of October might have been different. I think his instincts and his intellect told him this was dangerous anyway, because it certainly emboldened tin pot dictators, not only in Africa but elsewhere in the world, to challenge US interests. But let me be a little bit more precise in my answer to your question. Al-Qaeda were involved at a low level. They were training Islamic radicals in Somalia. But when the United States got involved, Al-Qaeda began to, and it's quite a pragmatic organization, they began to make overtures to the secular group led by General Ardid. General Ardid actually had no time for Islamic radicalism at all. And he was quite contemptuous, actually, of them. But he was happy to accept good support, good training from wherever he could get it when his interests were clashing with the United States. So he formed a tactical alliance in about June 1993 with Al-Qaeda. Part of the deal was that bin Laden himself was located in Sudan at this time. And some of he had a group of people, the so-called Afghan veterans. Some of his people were transferred. It was a porous border. They went into Somalia, and they gave Ardid's people training using rocket-propelled grenades. Because for some of you who watched the movie Black Hawk Down, what may have been slightly puzzling is that the Americans had flown Black Hawk helicopters with impunity, with no problems, from December right through December 92, right through to September 93. None of them had been shot down, nor had been any attempt to shoot them down. And suddenly, at the end of September, one was shot down with a rocket-propelled grenade. Now, within the US military, there was deep concern about this because this was indicating a new capability. The view at the time was that Ardid had improvised, or his followers had improvised in this fashion. What we now know from evidence gathered, not least there was the court procedures in New York that followed the 1998 bombings. This was the case of the US versus Osama bin Laden. We now know from evidence given from people captured from the Al-Qaeda organization that they were training Ardid's followers. And of course, that set the scene for the shooting down of the helicopters on the 3rd of October, and also the coordinated and triangulated fire against US forces, which came as a big surprise.
And may well have provided the weapons.
Yes, they may have provided some levels, but one thing we must be careful about is Al-Qaeda likes to brag. For example, it likes to claim the greatest victory, in Osama bin Laden's words, in 1997 was in Mogadishu. Actually, one of their biggest constraints was that many of the people involved in Al-Qaeda's organization were Arabs. They were light-skinned compared with the darker-skinned Somalis. And the Somalis really disliked the Al-Qaeda people. They have not, there's some animosity between people in Somalia and the Arab world. And the point to note was, in testimony given in that court case I just referred to, one Al-Qaeda person said we were limited how much we could get involved in the fight against the Americans in Mogadishu because we could only send Al-Qaeda personnel who had black or dark complexions, who could fit in and be seen credibly as followers of Ardid. So I think they certainly played a role. They played a training role, a facilitating role, but I don't think they were necessarily crucial.
I'd just like to take the microphone and the moderator's privilege, I guess, to ask a quick question, because the Kennedy Center produced a series of films called Beyond the Border, one of which is called Launch Pads to Lily Pads, and discusses the U.S. Basing troops temporarily, I guess, in Djibouti.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in your assessment of what impact that has had structurally on U.S. military forces and its posture in the region, and if you see that a trend toward increased basing or strategy for the region, or what importance that has for U.S. presence in Africa?
I think it is an important development, and I think it reflected a determination after 9/11 to monitor and oversee to monitor and oversee the unfolding situation in Somalia. The Bush administration said, I think within 2 months of 9/11, that they believed Somalia was a big threat now, because Afghanistan, in a sense, forced the Bush administration to accept, whether it liked it or not, that failed states were a strategic threat. I mean, Afghanistan was a very stark reminder of this. And then, so, therefore, Somalia came into sharp focus. It's very difficult to assess, I think, at this point in time, Corey, how long-term the commitment will be and what impact it's making on US force structure for the region. I think the Ethiopians appreciate the Americans being there. The United States has quite a good relationship with the Ethiopian government. They both share fears about radical Islam and Somalia. The interesting thing is, however, they have a difference or even a conflict of interest when it comes to Somalia. Ethiopia actually doesn't really want a central or stable government in Somalia per se, unless it's very friendly with Ethiopia. The United States, I think, has a different position. It wants a stable and representative government in Somalia, which can resist terrorism. They both come together on the threat of terrorism. That is to say, Ethiopia fears that an Islamic radical government in Mogadishu will actually destabilize Ethiopia, because the Somalis have a territorial claim on the Ogaden. And so there's a convergence of interest between the United States and Ethiopia, but when you start to probe that convergence of interest, it begins to separate because there are differences as well. Yes.
My name is Brian Hansen. I'm a political science major. My question is similar to the one that was just asked. I know that the United States government just recently announced and is in the process of establishing U.S. AFRICOM on the African continent. And I believe that it's sometime this year that they're physically going to be operating from Africa. And I was just curious how some of the previous problems have been that their focus and interest, like you said earlier, were kind of unclear. And then how, I guess, the impact that's having on U.S. relations with Africa.
Right, thank you for that interesting question. I think there has been a fair amount of disagreement within the Bush administration about how to operationalize this counter-terrorist strategy in Africa. What's interesting to me is, for example, the US ambassador to Kenya, Michael Renneberger, has, in the most diplomatic and most constrained way possible, has urged the Bush administration to concentrate on backing reconciliation on Somalia rather than, if you like, militarily taking on one group, such as the Islamic Courts Union. Why does he say this? Because as ambassador to Kenya, and Kenya has very close links with Somalia, he's very much aware that the Islamic Courts Union is a coalition of groups. Some are moderate, and how should I put it, have no connection with Al-Qaeda. There isn't a radical wing. The problem is, if you take a military approach, which may be well-intentioned to eliminate the terrorist threat, you may actually alienate moderate Islamic forces in the country. And so he's arguing that the crucial thing is to try to target this goal of reconciliation. The other complicating factor here is in the Somali case, and I suspect this applies to a number of African countries, but particularly in the Somali case, which complicates the use of having Africa Corps, is there are multiple internal problems, tribal problems, and that makes the problem of internal reconciliation that more difficult and that more frustrating for outsiders like the United States, which is trying to facilitate this. What I found interesting, there has been quite a difference of emphasis in the way the challenge of terrorism in Africa has been interpreted through the State Department as opposed to the spokespeople from the Pentagon. Thank you. Yeah.
My name's Jody Jensen, and I'm studying sociology and international development at BYU. And my question is, what do you think is the role of the U.S. and the UN in the Darfur crisis? Because we have seen so many things come to light in the past 10 years about what happened in Rwanda. I'm just curious what you think is the proper place for intervention in this crisis.
Well, it's interesting, the Darfur crisis, because in a sense it has become a high-profile issue in the United States. It is a much more awareness about the Darfur issue than some comparable crises elsewhere on the continent. I think that's a good thing. It was interesting to me the Bush administration, unlike the Clinton administration, didn't pull any punches when it described it as a genocide quite early on, what was occurring there. I think, in a sense, the Bush administration is trying and has continued to try to get support in the Security Council for a concerted approach to restrain these Arab militias who are at the heart of the problem. The problem is, of course, is you have several countries involved in Sudan who do not want to alienate the Sudanese government, one of whom is China. China has enormous energy needs. While it may not necessarily approve of what the Sudanese government is involved in, or indirectly involved in, it doesn't necessarily want to jeopardise what, from its point of view, is a promising relationship. It has signed several very large oil agreements with that government. So there is a problem in that sense of getting, the Bush approach, I think, is well-intentioned, and the question is, if you can't get to the Security Council to agree, which clearly there doesn't seem to be much prospect at the moment, then what do you do next? And I think that's really the real issue. Should the Bush administration take it upon itself to take some more proactive action, and then you have to go through the various possibilities. Well, sanctions are already in place, as I understand it, against Sudan. So there's very little left in the locker apart from some use of some sort of armed force. And when you look around, I think that would be very difficult to sell domestically. Although it's a tragic situation, you need more than just tragedy, I'm afraid, to sell, particularly with involvement in Afghanistan and in the Iraq War. It seems to me the Bush administration just would see that as in the too hard basket at the moment. But there may be, with a change of administration, perhaps if the Iraq War was not on, the Iraq invasion was not on, it might be a different ball game. But I'm sorry I can't offer you anything more crystal ball gazing than that. Thank you. Thanks very much.